I'm 32 years old, a nurse who has spent most of her adult life trying to patch up other people's wounds, both strangers and my family's. My name is Kelsey, though in my parents' eyes I was never really Kelsey. Never the daughter with dreams or a heart, just a resource. A savings account with legs, a safety net they never hesitated to fall back on. I always told myself that one day they'd see me differently, that my sacrifices would prove my worth. But the day I found that crumpled letter on the hardwood floor, my name scrawled across it like a cruel afterthought, I finally realized I had never been their daughter. I had only ever been their lifeline. The night before that letter, I believed I had saved my family. My mother had cried into my shoulder, whispering how I was her angel. My father, the man who hadn't hugged me in years, wrapped his arms tight around me, whispering, "You're our hero." For a moment I felt weightless, loved, needed. The hospital shifts, the sleepless nights, the debt I had taken on to pull them out of their own mess, it had all seemed worth it. I thought finally I mattered. I walked to my car that night with a smile so wide it hurt. For once my parents had looked at me not as a burden, not as the failure who never quite measured up to my brother Evan, but as the savior of the family home. And that home, oh, that home was more than wood and brick to me. It was the porch where I'd celebrated my 5th birthday, the stairs I crept down every Christmas morning, the only constant in a life where I always felt second best. But when I pulled up to the driveway the next afternoon, something was wrong. The curtains were gone. The flower beds Mom once fussed over had been ripped out. The driveway was empty. Inside the house was gutted like someone had sucked the life out of it in one cruel, efficient motion. And then I saw the envelope sitting in the middle of the floor. I picked it up with trembling hands. "Thanks for fixing our credit, loser. We moved to Florida with your brother. Don't call." No signature. No apology. Just those words. Words sharp enough to slice open every scar they'd ever left on me. I dropped the envelope and fell to my knees. My sobs should have shaken the walls, but instead the house just sat there silent and indifferent. Neighbors walked by and waved cheerfully as if I wasn't falling apart on the front lawn. I wanted to scream. I wanted to burn the house down so no one could have it. But instead I sat there and smiled because they didn't know the one thing that mattered most. When I paid off their debt, I had transferred the deed quietly into my name. Every document signed, notarized, filed. They thought they had sold the home out from under me, but the sale wasn't valid. For the first time in my life, I was the one holding the cards. They had betrayed me, abandoned me, erased me with a cruel note. But they were about to learn that I wasn't the same naive daughter who believed their every word. I had finally stopped listening to their lies and started reading the fine print. I didn't cry again that night. I didn't chase them with pleading texts or angry calls. Instead, I sat in the dark living room of an empty house, letter crumpled in my hand, watching the sunset bleed across the floorboards. They thought they had used me one last time, but they had made a mistake. They had raised a daughter too observant, too patient, too stubborn to die quietly in the shadows they forced her into. And as I sat there, a calmness washed over me. I wasn't going to be their victim anymore. If they wanted war, they had just declared it. And I knew exactly how to fight back. I didn't sleep that night. The house creaked and groaned like it was mocking me, reminding me of all the nights I lay awake as a child listening to my parents argue about money, about Evan, about how I never measured up. Back then, I used to press a pillow over my ears and pray they wouldn't notice me hiding on the stairs. Now, as I stared at the empty walls, I realized nothing had changed. They were still arguing, still choosing Evan, still leaving me behind. Only this time, they had done it with a letter instead of words. The next morning, I drove to the hospital and worked my shift as though nothing had happened. I changed dressings, held the hands of dying patients, reassured frightened families. On the outside, I was the calm, capable nurse everyone admired. On the inside, I was unraveling. My coworkers asked why I looked pale, why I hadn't eaten lunch, and I smiled and said I was fine. I had become good at lying about that. But in every quiet moment, in every empty hallway, the note screamed in my head, "Thanks for fixing our credit, loser." By the end of my shift, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to let them walk away laughing. For 32 years, I had been their scapegoat, their backup plan, their disposable daughter. That ended now. If they thought they could erase me with a single cruel line, they had underestimated me for the last time. I started small. I called the credit agency and double-checked that everything was still tied to me. It was. The deed was mine. The house legally mine. Their betrayal had been emotional, yes, but practically, they had no power. I laughed to myself when I realized that while they thought they'd left me ruined, they were the ones without a home. They had followed Evan to Florida, but Evan had no money. He lived in a rundown rental and spent most of his paycheck at bars. How long before my parents realized they had thrown away the only person who had ever bailed them out? The thought gave me a cruel sense of satisfaction. But satisfaction wasn't enough. I wanted them to feel it, to feel the kind of emptiness they had carved into me. So I made a plan. First, I tracked down Evan. It wasn't hard. His social media was still full of photos of him partying his arm around different women every weekend. Hashtags bragging about a life he could barely afford. When I scrolled through the comments, I saw one that made me pause. "Bro, aren't your parents living with you now, LOL?" My stomach turned. So it was true. They were crammed into that dingy little rental, probably pretending it was temporary until they got back on their feet. I almost pitied them. Almost. Then one evening I made a phone call I never thought I'd make. To a journalist, someone I had once met when he came to interview the hospital about budget cuts. I told him I had a story, a family story about betrayal, money, and fraud. He was skeptical until I told him the number $280,000. Suddenly, he was very interested. I didn't give him everything, just enough to bait him. Because this wasn't just about exposing them, it was about controlling the narrative. For once in my life, I wanted the story told from my side, not theirs. And then I waited. The first crack came faster than I expected. A week later, I got a call from my mother. Her voice was trembling the way it always did when she needed something. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't apologize. She went straight into panic. "Kelsey, the landlord here. He's threatening to kick us out. We need money for the deposit somewhere else. Just until we figure things out." I almost laughed. Just until we figure things out. That had been the chorus of my childhood. I pictured her sitting in Evan's shabby kitchen, wringing her hands, looking at me like I was still the obedient daughter who would do anything to keep them afloat. But I wasn't that daughter anymore. I let the silence stretch before I answered. "Mom, I already gave you everything I had. Remember the house, the money, the chance." My voice didn't shake. Hers did when she whispered my name, but I hung up before she could say more. For the first time in my life, I had the power to end the call. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't pace the floor. I sat in the empty living room with the letter still folded in my hand and smiled. They had chosen Evan. They had chosen Florida. They had chosen to leave me. But now I was the one choosing. And I chose to stop saving them. It was time they learned what it felt like to drown. The silence after I hung up on my mother was louder than any scream. For years, I had lived inside that silence, filling it with apologies, with frantic efforts to make things right, with endless sacrifices they never even noticed. But this time, I didn't run to fix it. I let the silence sit. I let it wrap itself around me like armor. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. I was free in it. Over the next few days, the calls didn't stop. Mom, Dad, even Evan tried. Evan left a message slurring about how I was ungrateful, how family was supposed to take care of each other. I laughed bitterly at that. Family. To them, family meant I was the servant and they were the masters. Family meant I was the lifeboat and they were the ones drilling holes into it. But the longer I ignored their calls, the stronger I felt. Then came the letter. Not scribbled in cruelty this time, but typed carefully worded, dripping with manipulation. They wrote about how hard things were in Florida, about how Evan had fallen on tough times, about how they were scared of losing everything. They begged for me to help them just this once, for real this time. At the bottom, my mother had written in her looping handwriting, "We love you, Kelsey. You're all we have." I stared at those words for hours. For a moment, a tiny part of me wanted to believe them. To believe that maybe this time they meant it, maybe this time they saw me as more than a bank account. But then I remembered the other note, the one that called me a loser, the one that told me not to call. That was their truth. This new letter was just desperation. And I wasn't going to let myself be fooled again. So instead of sending them money, I sent the journalist everything. The documents proving I had paid off the debt, the deed transfer, even the cruel note they had left behind. He called me back 2 days later, his voice alive with excitement. "Kelsey, this is going to make headlines. Are you sure you're ready for that?" Was I ready? No. But I was done hiding. If they wanted to turn me into the villain in their story, then I was going to write my own story louder. The article dropped the following week. The headline burned across the front page: "Daughter saves family from debt parents. Abandon her with nothing." My picture was there, a candid shot from the hospital, my tired eyes staring straight into the camera. The story spread like wildfire, shared on social media, whispered about in break rooms. Strangers reached out to me, some offering support, others telling me they had lived through the same betrayal. For once, I wasn't alone. For once, my pain wasn't invisible. And then came the fallout. My parents called again, but this time their voices weren't begging. They were furious. They screamed about how I had ruined their reputation, how Evan couldn't show his face at work, how neighbors were gossiping. My father's voice cracked with rage as he shouted, "Do you know what you've done?" Yes, I whispered to myself after I hung up. I finally told the truth. Days turned into weeks, and the silence between us became permanent. They didn't call anymore. Evan stopped posting his parties online. I imagined them all sitting in that cramped rental, bitter and angry, blaming me for their downfall. And maybe they were right to, because I had finally stopped being their savior and started being their reckoning. But even as I felt vindicated, even as I stood taller in my own skin, a deep ache lingered. I had always wanted them to love me, not for what I could do, but for who I was. And now I had to face the reality that they never would. That kind of love had never existed for me. The house I had saved wasn't a family home anymore. It was a tomb of memories, both beautiful and broken. One night, sitting on the porch with the cool air brushing my face, I realized something. I couldn't wait for them to apologize. I couldn't keep holding my breath for a love that would never come. My parents had left me with scars, yes, but I wasn't going to let those scars define me. I had saved the house, but more importantly, I had saved myself. And I knew deep down this was only the beginning of my story, the end of theirs, but the beginning of mine. The nights grew quieter after the article went viral. At first, I couldn't walk through the grocery store without overhearing whispers, neighbors, acquaintances, even strangers recognizing me as the daughter who was abandoned. Some gave me sympathetic looks, others pitying smiles. I hated both. Sympathy and pity had no place in my life anymore. I didn't want to be pitied. I wanted to be respected. At the hospital, coworkers treated me differently too. Some avoided me, afraid of prying into something so raw. Others leaned in with soft voices telling me how brave I was, how proud they were that I had spoken up. I nodded, thanked them, but inside I felt detached. None of them knew the years of erosion that had led to that headline, the decades of subtle cruelty of being erased in my own family. They only saw the explosion at the end, not the slow burn that came before it. One evening after a long shift, I came home to find an envelope slipped under my door. No return address, no stamp. My hands shook as I opened it, expecting another venomous note from my parents. But it wasn't. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed neatly, unsigned. "You may think you've won, but families don't break this easily. Blood always comes back to haunt you." I stared at it for a long time, my chest tightening. It had to be from them or Evan, some kind of desperate attempt to rattle me. And for a moment, it worked. I felt the old fear creeping back, in the fear of never escaping their grip. But then I tore the letter in half, and then in half again, until it was nothing but confetti on my floor. They had haunted me long enough. I wouldn't let them rent space in my head anymore. But I couldn't shake one thought: if they were willing to leave that letter at my door, what else were they willing to do? My parents had always been cruel in small, quiet ways. What if this time they wanted to be loud? That night, I double-checked the locks, pulled the curtains closed, and sat in the dark with a baseball bat across my knees. I hated that they still had this kind of power over me. But the longer I sat, the more I realized it wasn't fear keeping me awake, it was anger. I had given them everything. I had saved them from ruin. And still they wanted to punish me for not bleeding out on command. Days later, the journalist called again. "Kelsey, there's more interest in your story than we expected. Other outlets want interviews. National ones." I hesitated, but then I agreed. Because if my family wanted to keep haunting me, then I was going to shine a light so bright the whole world would see them for what they were. The interview aired a week later. I sat in a studio under hot lights telling my story in front of cameras. My voice shook at first, but then it grew stronger. I spoke about the debt, about the betrayal, about the note they left me. I showed the anchor, the house deed in my name, the documents proving everything. And then I said something I had never said out loud before: I wanted their love, but they gave me conditions. And when I stopped meeting those conditions, they left. That's not love, that's ownership. And I'm not property anymore. The clip spread faster than I expected. People sent me messages: strangers who had been abandoned by parents, betrayed by siblings, used by family who were supposed to protect them. They told me I gave them courage. For the first time, I felt my pain wasn't wasted. It had become a mirror for others, a beacon. But with the attention came the backlash. Anonymous comments accusing me of lying, of exaggerating, of turning on my family for fame. Some even said I should have kept quiet, that family loyalty was more important than truth. At first, the words cut deep. But then I realized something: these weren't people who had lived my life. They didn't know my scars. Their judgment didn't matter. Still, one message did shake me. It came from an unlisted number, just a single line: "Evan says hi." It wasn't signed, but I knew. My stomach dropped. My parents, my brother, they weren't finished. They were still out there, still circling, still waiting for me to slip. And I knew deep in my bones that the real battle hadn't even started yet. I held the phone in my hand for a long time after reading those words: "Evan says hi." My blood ran cold, but my face didn't move. I had learned after all these years how to go still when the storm raged around me. Inside, though, I was shaking. Evan had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. My parents gave him everything: money, attention, forgiveness, while I scraped together my own survival. And now he was their weapon. I didn't reply to the message. I didn't need to. Whoever sent it wanted to see me break. They wanted me to feel hunted. Instead, I decided that if Evan wanted to come back into my life, it would be on my terms, not theirs. The following week, the journalist called again. "Kelsey, your parents are trying to spin the story. They're saying you tricked them, that you stole the house out from under them." I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the phone. Of course they would. They had spent their whole lives twisting the truth. But something inside me snapped at the thought. I was done playing defense. I wasn't just going to protect myself anymore, I was going to fight back. So I gathered everything. Every text message where they begged for money. Every email where they promised they'd pay me back. Every cruel note, including the one they left on the floor of the empty house. I scanned them all, sent them to the journalist, and said, "Publish everything. Don't hold back." When the exposé went live, it was devastating. The headline read, "Parents abandon daughter. After $280,000 rescue, blame her for their ruin." The article laid out every detail, every receipt, every ugly truth. My parents had thought they could smear me, but the paper trail was undeniable. The world saw them for who they really were. For a while there was silence. No calls, no letters, no messages. I thought maybe they had finally given up. I started to breathe easier, to walk through my house without checking every corner, to sleep without clutching the bat. I even began painting the empty walls, turning the place into a home that was mine, not just a monument to what they had taken. But peace never lasts long in families like mine. One evening, as I came home from work, I found Evan sitting on the front steps. He looked older, thinner eyes, bloodshot like he hadn't slept in days. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize him. "You ruined everything," he said flatly when I approached. His voice had none of the charm he used to wield so easily. "They can't show their faces anywhere. Dad's sick. Mom cries every night. And it's your fault." My hands shook, but not from fear, from rage. I looked him in the eye and said, "No, Evan. It's their fault. It's yours. You all made your choices. I just stopped paying the bill." He flinched like I had struck him. For the first time in my life, I saw guilt flicker across his face. But then it hardened. "You'll regret this," he muttered and stalked away into the night. I stood there long after he disappeared, the streetlights buzzing overhead. Maybe he was right. Maybe I would regret it. But not tonight. Tonight, for the first time, I felt powerful. Not because I had destroyed them, but because I had survived them. Weeks passed. My parents never showed up again. Evan didn't return. But their absence was its own kind of ghost, following me through every hallway of that house. Some nights I would sit on the porch and wonder if I had gone too far, if exposing them had been cruelty instead of justice. But then I would remember the note, "Thanks for fixing our credit, loser," and the doubt would burn away. I didn't laugh often back then. But one morning as I stood in my kitchen sipping coffee, it hit me all at once. They had left me behind thinking they had taken everything. Yet here I was standing in the house they thought they had stolen the deed in my name, the truth on my side. I laughed until my chest ached, until the sound echoed through the empty rooms like a promise. For once the laughter was mine, and for the first time in my life I knew I was free.